room was quiet in a way that felt heavy, not peaceful. Machines hummed softly, filling the silence with a steady rhythm that reminded everyone that time was still moving, even if it didn't feel like it inside those walls. The blinds were half closed, letting in thin lines of pale afternoon light that stretched across the bed. He lay there, still and distant. The former ranger had been brought in days ago, but it already felt like much longer to the staff. There was something about him that made time slow down. Maybe it was the way he stared at nothing, or the way he refused to respond, as if he had stepped out of the world everyone else was still living in. A nurse stepped quietly into the room, careful not to make too much noise. She had seen many patients like this before. Tired, withdrawn, holding on in their own way. She carried a small tray, her movements calm and practiced. There was kindness in her eyes, the kind that came from years of trying to help people who didn't always want help. "Good afternoon," she said gently, setting the tray down. No response. She moved a little closer, adjusting the blanket near his shoulder. "I'm here to check on you," she added, her voice soft but steady. His eyes shifted just barely. He didn't look at her directly, but there was awareness there. For a moment it seemed like he might speak. Instead, he turned his face away. The nurse paused, unsure if she should try again or give him space. She had been warned already. The others had told her how it would go. "He refuses everyone," one of them had said earlier, almost apologetically. "Doesn't matter who you are." Still, she tried once more. "If you need anything, you can tell me." Silence answered her. After a few seconds, she let out a quiet breath and continued her work, checking his vitals and making small adjustments. She didn't rush. Even if he didn't want her there, she wouldn't treat him like he didn't matter. When she finished, she gave him one last glance. His face was calm, but not peaceful. There was something closed off about it, like a door that had been shut a long time ago. She left the room quietly. Outside, in the hallway, another nurse leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "How did it go?" she asked. The first nurse shook her head slightly. "Same as before." The other nurse sighed. "Yeah, that sounds about right." They both fell silent for a moment. It wasn't frustration exactly. It was something closer to helplessness. "He won't even look at us," the second nurse said. "It's like we're not even there." The first nurse glanced back toward the closed door. "He is aware," she said quietly. "You can tell. He just doesn't want anything from us. Or anyone," the other added. Their conversation drifted away after that, replaced by the usual sounds of the hospital. Phones ringing, footsteps passing, quiet voices speaking behind doors. Inside the room, nothing had changed. The ranger remained still, his breathing slow and even. But his mind was not as quiet as his body. Thoughts moved through him like distant echoes, hard to hold on to, harder to understand. He was aware of the voices that came and went, the hands that adjusted things around him, the presence of people who tried to reach him. But he didn't let them in. Trust was not something he could give so easily anymore. Maybe it had been once. Maybe there was a time when he would have welcomed help, or even asked for it. That time felt very far away now. Footsteps passed the door. Voices rose and faded. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled as it was pushed along. Life continued outside, steady and normal. Then, sometime later, the door opened again. But this time it wasn't a nurse. The sound was softer, almost hesitant. The person who entered didn't carry a tray or medical tools. Instead, there was the faint squeak of a mop bucket, followed by the quiet swish of a mop moving across the floor. The janitor moved slowly, carefully, as if trying not to disturb the stillness of the room. His clothes were simple, his posture slightly bent from years of work that often went unnoticed. He didn't look toward the bed right away. He focused on the floor, on the small details of his task. To anyone passing by, it would have looked like just another routine moment. A worker doing his job, unnoticed and unimportant. But the janitor noticed everything. He had seen the nurses come and go. He had heard the quiet conversations in the hallway. He knew, in the way that people like him often did, that something about this room was different. As he worked, his eyes flicked briefly toward the bed. The ranger hadn't moved. Still, the janitor lingered just a little longer than necessary. Not enough to draw attention, not enough to seem unusual. Just enough to take in the details, the stillness, the silence, the feeling that something was being held back. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. There was a kind of understanding in quiet observation, a patience that didn't demand answers. After a few minutes, he moved toward the door, guiding the bucket carefully so it wouldn't make too much noise. Before leaving, he glanced back once more. For just a second, it seemed like the ranger's eyes had shifted. It was hard to tell. The janitor didn't react. He simply stepped out and closed the door behind him. The room returned to silence. Hours passed. The light outside faded, replaced by the soft glow of evening. Another nurse came in, then another. Each one tried, in their own way, to reach him. Each one left with the same quiet disappointment. He refused them all. Not with anger, not with harsh words, just with absence. It was as if he had built a wall so strong that nothing could pass through it. And yet, something had changed, so small that no one noticed. Except, perhaps, the man who wasn't really supposed to notice anything at all. In the hallway, the janitor pushed his cart slowly, moving from one room to the next. His work was steady, almost invisible to the busy world around him. People passed him without a second glance, their minds focused on more urgent things. But every now and then, his eyes drifted back toward that one door. The one where the ranger lay, silent and distant. There was something there. Not something obvious. Not something anyone could point to and explain. Just a feeling. And sometimes that was enough to make a person pay attention. Inside the room, the ranger remained still. But somewhere deep within, a faint awareness lingered. Not of the nurses, not of the doctors, but of something quieter. Something that didn't ask anything from him. Something that simply noticed. The next morning arrived with the same quiet routine as the days before it. Soft light slipped through the blinds again, forming pale stripes across the floor. Machines continued their steady rhythm, unchanged and patient, as if they had all the time in the world. The room itself felt unchanged on the surface, but something small and unspoken had begun to settle inside it. The former ranger was still in the same position. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't refused anything either. He simply existed there, like someone waiting for something that no one else could see. Outside his room, the hospital was already awake and busy. Footsteps echoed through the hallways. Doors opened and closed. Voices rose and fell in controlled urgency. Everything was moving, always moving, as if stillness was something the building refused to allow anywhere except in places like this room. A nurse stood near the station, reviewing notes from the night shift. She glanced up toward the hallway where the ranger's room was located. "He didn't let anyone in again?" another nurse asked, sipping a quick cup of tea before her shift fully began. The first nurse shook her head. "Same as always. No change." There was a pause. "It's been days now," the second nurse said quietly. "He's awake. He knows we're there. He just shuts us out." The first nurse leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "It's not just refusal," she said. "It's like he's made a decision not to connect at all." Why would someone do that? No one answered that question. Some questions in hospitals didn't get easy answers. They just hung in the air and followed people around during their shifts. Down the hallway, a cleaning cart rolled slowly across the floor. The janitor moved with steady steps, his hands guiding the cart with quiet familiarity. He had been working in the hospital for years, long enough to know the rhythms of the place without needing to be told. He knew which rooms stayed busy and which ones stayed quiet. He knew which doors opened often and which ones barely opened at all. But that one room had stayed in his mind since yesterday. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Not because anyone had told him to pay attention. It was something simpler than that. The way the man inside had looked at nothing, yet somehow seemed aware of everything. The janitor stopped outside the door for a moment longer than necessary. A nurse passed by behind him, not paying attention. Another staff member walked past while speaking into a phone. No one noticed him standing there. He wasn't supposed to be part of the conversations in this part of the hospital. People rarely stopped to talk to him unless they needed something cleaned or fixed. Still, he stood there quietly, then finally pushed the door open. The room was the same as before. Dim light, soft machine sounds. The ranger lying still, eyes open but distant. The janitor didn't speak immediately. He simply entered and began his routine. He moved slowly, careful not to disturb the space. He checked the floor near the bed, adjusted the curtain slightly so it didn't drag, and wiped a small surface near the window. Everything he did was quiet and deliberate. The ranger did not react. At least not at first. There was a long stretch of silence where nothing seemed to change. The janitor worked as if the man in the bed was just another part of the room, like the furniture or the machines. Not invisible, just not engaged. But the ranger's eyes shifted slightly as the mop moved across the floor. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. The janitor noticed. He didn't stop working. He didn't look directly at him. He simply continued, as if nothing had changed at all. That was something he had learned over time. Sometimes people needed silence more than attention. After a few minutes, he finished what he needed to do. He stood near the door, holding the mop bucket handle loosely. He could have left immediately. That would have been normal. That would have been expected. Instead, he paused. His eyes briefly moved toward the ranger. The ranger was still looking in his direction now, but not directly at him. It was more like he was watching something behind him, or something he couldn't quite focus on. The janitor shifted his weight slightly. Still no words. Then he turned to leave. That should have been the end of it. Another quiet cleaning visit. Another unnoticed moment. But as he reached the door, a sound broke the silence. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was enough to freeze him in place. A breath that wasn't just part of the machine-assisted rhythm. The ranger had shifted. The janitor turned his head slightly, just enough to see. The ranger's eyes were now more focused than before. Not fully clear, but no longer distant in the same way. There was tension there. Something waking up behind the stillness. Still, no words came. The janitor didn't move closer. He didn't speak. He simply watched for a moment longer, then stepped out quietly and closed the door behind him. In the hallway, the noise of the hospital returned immediately, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had. Later that morning, the nurses returned for their rounds. One of them entered the ranger's room with careful steps, clipboard in hand. "Good morning," she said softly. The ranger did not turn away this time. That was new. She paused, surprised but careful not to show it too strongly. "I'm going to check your vitals now, all right?" No refusal. No rejection. Just silence. She moved forward slowly, her hands steady but her mind alert. She checked the equipment, adjusted the lines, and observed his condition. Everything seemed medically consistent, but something about his alertness felt different. He was watching. Not her exactly. Not the equipment. Something else. When she finished, she hesitated before leaving. Normally, she would have spoken again, offered reassurance, or reminded him she would return later. But something about his expression stopped her. It wasn't openness. It wasn't trust. It was awareness. Like he was listening for something that had nothing to do with her. She left the room with more questions than answers. In the hallway, she met another nurse. "He's different today," she said quietly. The other nurse frowned. "Different how?" "He looked at me." That made the other nurse pause. "He's looked at people before." "Not like this," she replied. It felt like he was actually there. They exchanged a glance, both unsure what to make of it. Meanwhile, the janitor continued his rounds on another floor. His work remained the same. Mop, bucket, quiet steps, empty rooms, full rooms, repeat. But his thoughts kept drifting back to that one door. He didn't know why. There was no clear reason. No explanation he could offer if someone asked him. But he had learned over the years that not everything meaningful came with explanations. Some things were just noticed before they were understood. And that room felt like one of those things. By late afternoon, the hospital settled into a calmer rhythm. Fewer urgent footsteps, softer voices, longer pauses between movements. The light outside shifted again, warmer now, stretching deeper into the hallway floors. The ranger remained in his bed, still mostly quiet, but no longer completely withdrawn in the same way. And the janitor, finishing his shift, found himself once again standing near that door without planning to. He didn't enter this time. He simply stood there for a moment. From inside the room, there was no sound of refusal. No sound at all. But for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel empty. Felt like something was waiting to be filled. The hospital had its usual rhythm that morning, but something subtle felt different around the room where the former ranger stayed. It was not something that could be measured or written in a report. It was more like a shift in atmosphere, something that people felt when they passed by but couldn't easily explain. Inside the room, the man lay as he always did, still, quiet, watching without fully engaging with the world around him. The machines beside him continued their steady work, soft beeps marking time in a way that felt both comforting and distant. But his eyes were not as distant as before. They moved more often now. Not quickly, not nervously, just aware. The morning nurse noticed it first when she entered with her usual calm steps. She had been assigned to him more often lately, partly because no one else wanted to deal with the emotional weight of his silence. She didn't mind. She had learned not to take things personally in this job. "Good morning," she said softly as she stepped in. No refusal. No turning away. That alone made her pause slightly, though she kept her expression steady. "I'm just here to check on you," she added, moving closer. His eyes followed her this time. Not fully locked, but not avoiding her either. It was a small change, but in a hospital even the smallest changes mattered. She continued her routine, checking his vitals and adjusting the equipment. Her movements were careful, respectful of his space. She had learned that forcing interaction only made him withdraw further. When she finished, she hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "You seem a little more awake today." No answer. But there was a slight shift in his gaze, like he had heard her clearly. That alone was new. She left the room feeling uncertain but curious. Something was changing, though she couldn't understand what or why. In the hallway, she met another nurse near the station. "He's different again," she said quietly. The second nurse raised an eyebrow. "Different how this time?" "He's watching, not just looking away anymore." The second nurse frowned slightly. "That doesn't sound like him at all." "That's why I'm saying it," she replied. "Something is changing." They both looked toward the closed door at the end of the hallway. Neither of them knew what was happening inside that room, but both felt the same unease mixed with curiosity. Meanwhile, on another floor, the janitor continued his work as usual. The mop moved slowly across the polished floor, his hands steady, his steps familiar. He had worked in many parts of the hospital over the years, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that one room. Not because of anything obvious, but because of something unspoken. He remembered the moment from the day before, the way the ranger's eyes had shifted, the way silence had changed its shape, no longer completely empty. As he cleaned near a window, he paused briefly and looked out at the courtyard below. People came and went. Cars moved slowly through the entrance road. Life continued in its usual way. But his attention wasn't outside. It was inside the building. Back in the room later that day, something happened that broke the usual pattern completely. It started with a sound. Not loud. Not alarming. Just a small accident. The ranger had been lying still when a nurse adjusted the bedside table. A metal tray slipped slightly from her hand and tapped against the floor. It wasn't a serious noise, but it was sudden enough to cut through the quiet rhythm of the room. The nurse immediately bent down to pick it up. "Sorry about that," she said quickly, though it was more out of habit than necessity. But the reaction from the bed was immediate. The ranger moved. Not dramatically, not in panic. But his head turned sharply toward the sound, and his eyes focused in a way that hadn't been seen before. The nurse froze for a second, unsure of what she was seeing. He wasn't just aware now. He was alert. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, trying to keep her voice calm. No answer came, but his gaze stayed fixed on the spot where the tray had fallen, as if the sound had triggered something deep inside him. The nurse slowly finished her task and stepped back, watching him carefully. There was something different about his expression now. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, like something had touched a memory that had been buried for a long time. She left the room quietly, unsure of what had just happened. Down the hall, she told another nurse what she had seen. "He reacted," she said, "to a sound. He actually reacted." The other nurse looked surprised. "That's not possible. He barely responds to anything." "I know," she replied, "but I saw it." They both fell silent for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Meanwhile, the janitor arrived on the same floor a short while later. He was pushing his cart slowly, unaware of the exact details of what had happened, but feeling something different in the air as he approached the corridor. It was subtle, a kind of tension that didn't belong to the usual hospital routine. He stopped near the door again. This time, he didn't immediately move on. Inside the room, the ranger was still facing the same direction. His posture had changed slightly since earlier in the day. Less withdrawn, more present, as if part of him had been pulled back into the room. The janitor stood there for a moment, then gently knocked on the door before entering. It was not a loud knock, just a soft tap, a courtesy. He stepped inside. The ranger's eyes moved toward him immediately. This time there was no delay, no confusion, just focus. The janitor paused slightly, as if acknowledging that something had changed since his last visit. He didn't speak. He simply began his usual work, moving toward the floor near the window. But the ranger's eyes followed him. Not in a wandering way, not distracted, consistent. The janitor noticed but continued cleaning without reacting outwardly. He had learned not to force meaning into moments too quickly. Some things revealed themselves slowly. As he worked, the silence in the room felt different. It was no longer the heavy silence of avoidance. It was something closer to waiting. At one point, the janitor's mop handle lightly tapped the floor. It was a small sound, barely noticeable, but the ranger's eyes shifted immediately toward it. The janitor paused for a fraction of a second, then continued as if nothing had happened. But now he knew for sure. The ranger was not just present. He was listening. When the janitor finished his cleaning, he moved toward the door again. This time, he hesitated slightly longer than before. Behind him, the ranger made a small movement. Not a full turn. Not a gesture. Just a slight shift, as if trying to follow something he could not yet fully reach. The janitor didn't leave immediately. He stood with his hand on the door handle for a moment. Neither of them spoke. The room was silent again, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full of something unspoken, something that had not yet found its shape. Finally, the janitor stepped out and closed the door gently behind him. In the hallway, he paused. For the first time, he did not immediately move on to the next task. He stood there, still, as if trying to understand something he could not put into words. Behind that closed door, something had shifted. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to change everything that would come next. The hospital had a different kind of quiet that evening. It was not empty, but it felt slower, like the entire building had lowered its voice. The daytime rush had faded, replaced by longer pauses between footsteps and softer conversations. Lights in the hallway had shifted to a warmer tone, and the air carried the faint smell of cleaning solution mixed with something calm and familiar. Inside the room, the former ranger remained in bed, but he was not the same as before. Something had changed in him over the past day. It was not sudden, not dramatic. It was subtle, like a locked door that had finally loosened just enough for air to slip through. He still did not speak, but he was no longer completely distant. His eyes followed movement now. His attention lingered longer on sound. And most noticeably, he no longer turned away from everyone who entered. A nurse came in during the early evening with her usual careful steps. She paused at the door for a second, as if preparing herself mentally for the usual silence. But when she entered, she noticed immediately that something was different. He was looking at her, not through her. She slowed her pace slightly, trying not to react too strongly. In hospitals, sudden changes could mean many things, and not all of them were simple. "Good evening," she said gently. He did not respond, but he did not turn away either. She moved closer, checking the monitors and adjusting the equipment. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts were not. She had been working with him for days now, and this shift in behavior felt almost like meeting a different person. "You're staying more awake now," she said softly, more to herself than to him. His gaze shifted slightly toward her voice. It was small, but it was enough. She finished her tasks and hesitated before leaving. Normally, she would have left quickly, respecting his silence. But something about the way he was watching now made her pause. It was not fear. It was not confusion. It was awareness, like he was trying to understand something he had not been able to see before. She left the room slowly. In the hallway, she exhaled quietly and leaned against the counter for a moment. "He's changing," she said to another nurse nearby. The other nurse looked up from her notes. "Changing how?" "He's responding. Not much, but enough to notice." The second nurse frowned. "That's strange. He was completely shut off before." "I know," she said, "but now he's there, more present." Neither of them spoke for a moment after that. The idea didn't fully make sense, but they had both learned that patients could change in unexpected ways. Still, this felt different. Down another corridor, the janitor was finishing his shift. His cart moved slowly, wheels soft against the polished floor. He had been working in hospitals long enough to understand that evenings carried their own kind of weight. People were tired. Emotions were quieter but deeper. And sometimes, things that had been hidden during the day surfaced in small ways at night. He stopped near the supply room, checking his equipment, but his mind was not fully on the task. Kept returning to that room. He had not planned for it to matter. His job was simple. Clean, maintain, move on. He had learned long ago not to attach himself to places or people. It made the work easier that way. But this was different. There was something about the way the ranger looked at him. Not as a patient usually looks at staff. Not as someone lost in illness or confusion, but as someone trying to recognize something familiar. The janitor pushed his cart forward again, but his steps were slower than usual. Later that evening, he found himself standing outside the room without even planning it. He stopped. The hallway was quieter now. Most staff had moved toward end-of-shift tasks. A few nurses passed by without stopping. No one paid attention to him standing there. He placed his hand lightly on the door handle. For a moment he did not move. Then he entered. The room was dimmer than before. The light from the bedside lamp was low, casting soft shadows across the walls. The ranger was awake, as usual now, but this time his gaze turned toward the door immediately. There was no hesitation. The janitor stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind him. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was not awkward. It was not forced. It was something closer to recognition without understanding. The janitor slowly began his routine, even though the room was already clean. It was not about the work anymore. It was about presence. He wiped a small surface near the window, adjusted the curtain slightly, and checked the floor out of habit. The ranger watched every movement. His eyes followed without distraction. After a few minutes, the janitor stopped. He did not look at the ranger directly at first. He simply stood still, holding the mop handle loosely. The silence in the room felt different again. Heavier in meaning, lighter in tension. Then something unusual happened. The ranger spoke. It was not clear at first. The voice was weak, rough from disuse. But it was real. "Wait." The janitor stopped immediately. He did not turn fully yet. He just paused. The ranger repeated it more clearly this time, though still strained. "Don't go." The words hung in the air, not as a command, not as a demand, but as something closer to uncertainty. The janitor slowly turned his head. Their eyes met for the first time directly. There was a long silence after that. Not uncomfortable, just full. The ranger's expression shifted slightly, like he was struggling to place something that was right in front of him but still out of reach. "I know you." the ranger said slowly. The janitor did not answer immediately. He simply watched. The ranger tried again, his voice shaking slightly. I don't know how, but I know you. The janitor's grip on the mop tightened slightly, then relaxed again. Still, he said nothing. The ranger looked frustrated now. Not angry, but emotionally unsettled. I've seen you before, he added quietly. Not here. That sentence changed the air in the room. Something deep inside the ranger seemed to surface with effort, like a memory trying to break through layers of time and silence. The janitor finally spoke, but only a few words. You might be remembering wrong. His voice was calm, steady, but not dismissive. The ranger shook his head slightly. No, he said. It's not wrong. His breathing became slightly uneven, as if trying to hold onto something slipping away. I don't remember everything, he continued, but I remember you. The janitor stood still. Outside the room, the hospital continued its usual rhythm. Cart rolled down the hallway. A door closed somewhere far away. A phone rang briefly and was answered. Life outside this moment continued without interruption. But inside this room, something was unfolding that did not belong to routine. The ranger tried to sit up slightly but struggled. The effort left him visibly tired. The janitor stepped forward without thinking and adjusted the pillow behind him gently. It was a small action, automatic, but it caused the ranger to stop speaking for a moment. He looked at the janitor differently now. Less confusion, more certainty. You used to stand like that, the ranger said quietly. The janitor froze slightly. The ranger continued, slowly, carefully. When I couldn't sleep, when everything felt like it was breaking apart, you used to just stand there, not asking anything, not forcing anything. The janitor looked down for a moment, then back up. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The ranger's voice softened. You were there. It was not a question anymore. It was recognition forming through fragments. The janitor finally spoke again, quietly. That was a long time ago. The ranger closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if the effort of remembering was exhausting. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. Not full clarity, but connection. I thought I lost that part, he said. The janitor did not respond. He simply stood there. Neither of them moved for a long time. The hospital outside continued to exist, but inside the room time felt different. Slower, heavier, more real. And for the first time since the ranger had arrived, he was not alone in his silence. But what neither of them fully understood yet was that whatever connection had just resurfaced was not finished revealing itself. It was only beginning. The room stayed quiet long after the janitor's last words faded. Not the empty kind of quiet that had filled it before, but something heavier and more meaningful. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people stop avoiding a truth that has been waiting for them for a long time. The former ranger remained still in bed. His eyes open but no longer distant in the same way they had been days earlier. Something inside him had shifted again. The effort of speaking had taken a toll, but it had also opened a door he could no longer fully close. The janitor stood near the end of the bed, not moving, not speaking. His hands rested lightly on the handle of his cleaning cart outside the room, but he had not reached for it again. For the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about his next task. He was thinking about what was already in front of him. The ranger broke the silence first, his voice weaker now but steadier than before. It's not just a feeling, he said slowly. I can see it when I try to remember. You were there when everything fell apart. The janitor looked down for a moment, then back at him. Memory is not always clear, he said quietly. The ranger gave a faint shake of his head. This part is. A long pause followed. The machines beside the bed continued their steady rhythm, unchanged by the emotional weight in the room. Outside, footsteps passed in the hallway. A distant announcement echoed through the hospital system, then faded. Life continued normally for everyone else. But inside this room, nothing felt normal anymore. The ranger tried to shift slightly, his hand tightening around the edge of the blanket. There was frustration in his expression now, not directed at anyone, but at the fragments of his own mind. "I stopped letting people in," he said. "Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't tell what was real anymore." The janitor listened without interrupting. The ranger continued, his voice becoming more strained. "After the missions, after everything, faces started blending together. Days didn't feel like days. I couldn't sleep without hearing things that weren't there anymore." He paused, breathing slowly. "I remember someone standing outside the door sometimes, not speaking, just there." The janitor's expression did not change, but something in his eyes tightened slightly. The ranger looked directly at him now. "It was you." The janitor remained silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once. It was small, simple, but it carried weight. "Yes," he said finally. "Sometimes it was me." The ranger closed his eyes for a moment, as if the confirmation had settled something deep inside him. Not fully healed, not fully understood, but real. When he opened them again, his voice was quieter. "Why didn't you leave?" The janitor shifted his stance slightly. It was a question that seemed to carry more years than the room itself. "I was told to clean," he said. "But sometimes cleaning meant more than just floors." The ranger gave a faint, almost invisible expression that might have been a broken smile. "That doesn't sound like an answer." "It is the only one I have," the janitor replied calmly. Another silence followed. This time it was not uncomfortable. It was reflective, like both of them were standing in the middle of something neither fully controlled nor fully understood. The ranger's breathing slowed slightly. "I stopped trusting voices," he said. "Doctors, nurses, even myself. Everything felt like noise I couldn't separate anymore." He looked away toward the window. "But I remember one thing clearly now. There was a presence that didn't ask anything from me." The janitor stayed still. The ranger continued. "It didn't try to fix me. Didn't try to pull me back into conversations I couldn't handle. It just stayed." The janitor looked toward the floor for a brief moment. "I didn't think I mattered," the ranger admitted quietly. "Not anymore." The janitor spoke softly. "That is not what I saw." The ranger turned back to him. "What did you see then?" The janitor hesitated. Not because he didn't know, but because the answer was not simple. "I saw someone still there," he said, "even when they tried not to be." The ranger's eyes softened slightly. The tension in his shoulders eased just a little. For the first time since his arrival at the hospital, he didn't look like someone resisting the world. He looked like someone trying to return to it. A nurse passed by the door outside and slowed for a moment when she noticed the light still on. She hesitated, then continued walking. She had learned by now that some rooms needed space, even if she didn't fully understand why. Inside, the conversation continued quietly. The ranger spoke again, slower now. "I thought I lost everything that mattered out there," he said. "I didn't think anything followed me here." The janitor responded gently. "Some things don't follow you," he said. "They wait." That sentence lingered in the air. The ranger absorbed it in silence. After a while, he spoke again, but this time his voice carried something different. Less confusion, more acceptance. "I don't know what I'm supposed to remember fully," he said, "but I know enough now to stop pushing everything away." The janitor nodded slightly. "That is enough for now." The ranger looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked something quieter. "Will you stay a little longer?" The question was not about cleaning or duty. It was not about routine. It was something more personal, more fragile. The janitor looked at the door, then back at the ranger. "I am still on shift," he said. The ranger gave a faint nod, accepting the answer without protest. But then the janitor added something unexpected. "But I can stay a little longer before I move on." The ranger didn't respond with words. He simply closed his eyes briefly, as if letting that answer settle into him. For a while, neither of them spoke again. The room felt different now. Not fully healed, not fully explained, but no longer closed off. The silence had changed its shape. It was no longer a wall. It was a space where understanding could exist without pressure. Later, a nurse came in for a final check before night fully settled in. She paused when she saw both of them in the room. The janitor was still there, standing quietly near the window, and the ranger was awake, calm in a way she had never seen before. "You're still awake," she said softly. The ranger turned his head slightly. "Yes," he replied. It was the first complete word he had given her without resistance. She looked briefly between him and the janitor, sensing something had changed but not understanding what. Still, she did not interrupt it. She finished her routine quietly and left. After she was gone, the ranger spoke again, this time with less strain. "I think I can sleep tonight," he said. The janitor nodded once. "That is good." The ranger looked at him again. "You don't have to stay after that," he added. The janitor understood what he meant. "I know," he said. Another pause. Then the ranger added something quieter. "But I think I will remember this part better than the rest." The janitor didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at him for a moment longer than usual. Then he spoke softly. "Memory comes back slowly, not all at once." The ranger gave a faint nod. "I think I can wait for it now." The janitor finally moved toward the door, slowly, not abruptly. He paused at the handle and looked back once more. The ranger was still watching him. Not with confusion anymore. Not with distance. But with something closer to recognition and calm. The janitor opened the door. Before stepping out, he said quietly, "Rest now." The ranger gave a small nod. The door closed gently. Outside, the hallway was quiet again. The janitor stood there for a moment, his cleaning cart beside him, but he did not move immediately. He looked down the corridor, then back at the closed door. Something had changed in that room. Not just in the patient, but in the space between two people who had once passed each other without meaning, and now could no longer do so in the same way. He finally started walking again, slowly, not away from the room, but forward into whatever came next.